Welcome back to the deep dive. We often talk about trust in the digital age, right? Like, how do you know that the information you're seeing online is actually reliable?
It's one of the most fundamental questions in computer science, really. How do you establish trust when you're dealing with systems where there's no central authority, no single source of truth?
Exactly. Especially when those systems are distributed, like a bunch of computers spread out across the world, each with its own perspective.
And potentially with its own motives.
Right, which is where things get really tricky. So today, we're going deep into a fascinating paper titled The Flare Consensus Protocol: Byzantine Fault Tolerance with Federated Virtual Voting, authored by Dr. Orkun Feziolu.
Sounds like a mouthful.
Mm.
But it's actually tackling a very practical problem. How to get all those distributed computers to agree on something important, like the validity of a financial transaction, even if some of them might be trying to game the system.
We're basically trying to figure out how to build systems that are resilient to deception or failure.
And the classic example of this challenge is the so-called Byzantine generals problem.
Okay, so what are these Byzantine generals all about? What's the analogy here?
Imagine a group of generals from the Byzantine Empire, each commanding their own army, surrounding a city they want to conquer.
Got it.
Now, to succeed, they need to coordinate their attack. They need to agree on whether to attack and when. But here's the catch. Some of these generals might be traitors.
Uh-huh. That's where the Byzantine part comes in. Treacherous generals.
They might send false messages to their fellow generals trying to sabotage the attack.
So the challenge is for the loyal generals to figure out a way to communicate and reach a reliable agreement, even if they can't be sure who's telling the truth.
Exactly. That's the essence of the Byzantine generals problem, and it's essentially what we're dealing with in any decentralized digital system where you can't be 100% certain about the reliability of all the participants. This type of potential failure, where a component of a system acts in an unpredictable or even malicious way, is what we call a Byzantine failure.
I see. So how does this whole Byzantine dilemma relate to something like validating transactions on a blockchain, for example?
Think about it. In a traditional financial system, if you try to spend the same dollar twice, the bank steps in. They have the central ledger. They're the ultimate authority that decides what transactions are valid and what transactions are not.
Right. The bank is like the all-knowing emperor in this scenario.
Precisely. But with blockchain technology, like Bitcoin, you don't have that central authority. The ledger is distributed across a network of computers.
A bunch of generals, each with their own copy of the battle plan.
Exactly. And they all need to reach a consensus on which transactions are valid and in what order they occurred.
So that no one can spend the same Bitcoin twice.
Exactly. That's where consensus mechanisms come in. They're the set of rules that govern how these distributed systems reach agreement, even if some participants are unreliable or even outright malicious.
Okay, now we're getting to the heart of it. And I know there are several different types of consensus mechanisms out there.
There are. You've probably heard of proof of work, like in Bitcoin, where miners solve complex mathematical puzzles to secure the network and add new blocks to the blockchain.
Yeah, the energy-intensive one.
There's also proof of stake, where the more cryptocurrency you hold, the more influence you have in validating transactions. And then there are a bunch of other fascinating approaches, like Federated Byzantine Agreement, or FBA, which is what this deep dive is all about.
And before we go further, just a quick reminder to our listeners that we have a detailed explanation of both proof of work and proof of stake in our show notes if you need a refresher.
Always good to have that resource.
Now, you mentioned that proof of stake, while it can be more energy efficient than proof of work, has a potential issue: this risk of creating top-heavy blockchains.
Right. And what we mean by top-heavy is that a relatively small number of participants, those with the most stake, could end up holding a disproportionately large amount of power in the network.
So even though it's decentralized in theory, in practice, it could start to resemble a system with a few very powerful players, kind of like an oligarchy of generals.
Precisely. And that can make the network vulnerable to various kinds of attacks or manipulation.
Okay, that's a crucial point for our listeners to understand why just having a lot of participants isn't enough. You need a mechanism that ensures that no single entity or even a small group can hijack the decision-making process.
Exactly. And that's where Federated Byzantine Agreement, or FBA, offers a really interesting alternative.
So how does FBA work? How does it address this potential for power concentration?
Instead of relying on a single, universally trusted authority like a bank or purely on economic stake, FBA allows each participant to define their own web of trust.
It's like each general gets to choose their own trusted advisors.
It's a beautiful analogy. They create what we call quorum slices. These are basically sets of other participants that they need to hear from to be confident that a decision is valid.
And the assumption is that there's enough overlap between these individual webs of trust that the network as a whole can still reach consensus, even if there are disagreements along the way.
Precisely. And what's really cool is that these trust relationships don't have to be symmetrical.
What do you mean by symmetrical?
Well, in traditional Byzantine agreement, the trust assumptions are often uniform. Everyone trusts the same set of participants. But in FBA, you have this concept of asymmetric trust.
So Alice might trust Bob, but Bob doesn't necessarily have to trust Alice back.
Exactly. This allows for a much more nuanced and realistic model of how trust works in the real world. And this is where things get really interesting. Imagine, for example, a system where participants need to agree on the validity of financial transactions.
Okay.
Participants operating within a specific country might choose to include their local regulatory bodies in their quorum slices.
So they're saying, hey, I trust my government's financial authorities to make sure things are on the up and up.
And someone else in a different country might have a totally different set of authorities they trust.
It's like each general consulting their own map of the battlefield, but they're all still working towards the same strategic goal.
Beautiful. And that's a key strength of FBA. It accommodates diverse perspectives on trust, which is essential for building truly decentralized and resilient systems. Now, are you ready to dive into some actual examples of FBA in action?
Let's do it.
So while Bitcoin uses proof of work, and we have other protocols like PBFT, which we won't get into today, there are real-world systems using the principles of FBA. A prominent example is the XRP ledger, the technology underpinning the XRP cryptocurrency. It uses a consensus protocol that incorporates elements of FBA to achieve agreement on transaction validity.
That's pretty cool. So it's not just a theoretical concept. It's being used in systems that handle real money.
And another example is the Stellar Consensus Protocol, or SCP. It also uses principles of FBA to achieve consensus in a decentralized network. SCP is used by the Stellar Network, which facilitates cross-border payments and asset issuance.
I'm seeing a theme here. FBA is being used in systems that aim to move money around quickly and efficiently without relying on traditional financial institutions.
You got it. It's about building financial systems that are more open, more accessible, and less reliant on those central points of control. And the research on FBA continues to evolve. One of the key areas of focus is improving performance, making these systems even faster and more efficient.
Which brings us to this paper's focus on virtual voting, right? Could you give our listeners a quick explanation of what that's all about?
You can think of virtual voting as a way to reach consensus without every participant having to explicitly broadcast their vote to everyone else in the network.
Okay, so it's like a shortcut in the communication process.
Exactly. The system can often deduce the likely outcome of a vote based on the patterns of message exchange. If a large enough portion of the network is sending messages that indicate support for a particular decision, the system can confidently assume that the vote will pass without needing everyone to weigh in explicitly.
That sounds like it could save a ton of time and bandwidth, especially in a large, geographically distributed network.
Precisely. And that efficiency translates into faster transaction confirmations and higher overall throughput. However, there's a catch. While virtual voting is great for efficiency, it can be vulnerable to what we call Sybil attacks.
Sybil attacks. Sounds ominous. What are those?
In a Sybil attack, a malicious actor tries to create a large number of fake identities, or Sybil nodes, within the network.
Like a digital puppet master controlling a whole army of sock puppet accounts.
Exactly. And in a system relying on simple virtual voting, these fake identities could potentially sway the outcome of a vote by casting a large number of coordinated votes, even if they represent just a single malicious entity.
So they're artificially inflating their influence?
Exactly, and that can undermine the integrity of the entire consensus process. But the real innovation in this paper, the heart of what makes the Flare Consensus Protocol, or FCP, so interesting, is how it combines the efficiency of virtual voting with the robust trust model of FBA to address this Sybil attack problem head-on.
Okay, now we're getting to the good stuff. So tell us, what makes FCP so special? What are the key things that set it apart from other consensus mechanisms out there?
Well, first and foremost, FCP is leaderless. There's no single participant, no general who has ultimate authority.
It's like a network of equals, each with its own voice.
Exactly. And this leaderless design makes the system much more resistant to targeted attacks because there's no single point of failure. It also promotes fairness because no single entity has the power to dictate the outcome of the consensus process.
That sounds like a huge win for decentralization. What else?
FCP is also what we call asynchronous Byzantine fault tolerant.
Now, there's a phrase we need to unpack for our listeners.
You're right. Asynchronous means that the system can handle situations where messages get delayed or arrive out of order. It doesn't rely on everyone being perfectly synchronized, which is essential in a real-world network where delays are inevitable. Byzantine fault tolerant means that the system can continue to operate safely and correctly, even if a certain number of participants are exhibiting Byzantine failures, they're acting maliciously or erratically.
So even if some of the generals are sending the wrong signals or their messengers are getting lost in the fog of war, the loyal generals can still figure out what to do.
Precisely. Now, in addition to being leaderless and fault-tolerant, FCP also ensures that transactions are totally ordered. This means that all participants will agree on a single, consistent sequence of transactions, which is vital for maintaining the integrity of the system's state.
Like a single authoritative timeline of events.
Exactly. And last but not least, FCP is designed to be highly scalable. This is where the magic of federated virtual voting comes into play.
Okay, federated virtual voting. This is what we've been building up to. Explain how it works and why it's such a big deal.
It combines the efficiency of virtual voting with the Sybil attack resistance of FBA. Remember how we said that in FBA, each participant defines their own trusted quorum slices?
Yes, their own little circle of trust.
Well, in federated virtual voting, those trust relationships are used to limit the influence of potentially malicious Sybil nodes. If a participant doesn't trust a particular set of nodes, even if there are a lot of them, they simply won't include them in their quorum slices.
So they're essentially saying, I don't care how many sock puppets you have, I'm not listening to you.
That's a great way to put it. And as a result, those Sybil nodes, even if they're numerous, won't be able to sway the virtual voting process because their votes are essentially ignored by the participants who don't trust them.
That's brilliant. It's like having a built-in spam filter for Sybil nodes.
Exactly. So FCP manages to reduce communication overhead similar to traditional virtual voting, while also preventing those fake identities from disrupting the consensus process.
That's a pretty remarkable combination.
Yeah.
But to really understand how FCP achieves this, we need to get a little more technical, right? We need to talk about graphs.
Graphs are the foundation of how information flows and consensus is reached in FCP. A graph is just a fancy way of representing relationships between things. You have a set of points called vertices, and you connect them with lines called edges. Think of it like a network of roads connecting different cities.
Okay, I can visualize that.
Now, in FCP, we're dealing with a specific type of graph called a directed acyclic graph, or DAG. Directed means that the edges have a direction, like a one-way road. Acyclic means that there are no cycles, no loops in the graph. You can't follow the edges and end up back where you started.
So it's like a network of one-way roads that always lead you forward, never in circles. What do the vertices and edges represent in the context of FCP?
The vertices represent messages that participants send to each other, and the edges represent the connections between those messages. When a participant creates a message, they include references to previous messages they've received, creating a chain of linked messages.
And because those references always point backward, we end up with a DAG. Okay, now we're starting to see how this graph structure captures the flow of information in the network.
Now, when we say that a message W is reachable from a message U, we mean that you can follow the directed edges from U to W. And this reachability property allows us to create a partial order of the messages in the day.
Partial order.
It means that we can say that some messages definitely came before others, but there might be pairs of messages where we can't say for sure which one came first.
Like if you have three messages, A, B, and C, and A reaches B and B reaches C, then we know A definitely came before C. But if there's no path between A and B, we can't say for sure which one came first.
You got it. Now, another important concept in a DAG is the notion of ancestors. The ancestors of a message are all the messages that can reach it by following the directed edges backward.
Like all the messages that came before it in the history of the network.
And the parents of a message are the messages that directly precede it, the ones that it directly references. Now remember that FBA relies on this idea of quorum slices, those sets of trusted participants.
Right.
Well, we can formally define a Federated Byzantine Agreement System, or FBAS, as a pair. Q, where V is the set of all participants in the network, and Q is the quorum function.
Okay, that makes sense. V is for all the generals, and Q defines who each general trusts.
Exactly. For each participant V and V, the quorum function QV specifies one or more quorum slices for V. These are sets of other participants that needs to hear from to be confident in a decision.
So it's like saying General Alice needs to get agreement from Generals Bob, Charlie, and David before she'll launch an attack.
And crucially, each participant is always included in all of their own quorum slices.
Okay, that makes sense. I trust myself.
Now, a quorum in FBA is a slightly different concept. It's a set of participants where every participant in the set has at least one of their quorum slices entirely contained within that same set. Think of it like a group that's self-sufficient in terms of trust. Everyone in the group trusts enough other people within the group to reach an agreement.
Okay, so it's like a mini network of trust within the larger network.
And one of the key properties of a well-designed FBAS is that it has quorum intersection. This means that any two quorums in the system always share at least one participant in common.
So no matter how you divide the network into these trusted groups, there's always at least one general who can act as a bridge between them.
Exactly. And this intersection is crucial for preventing the network from splitting into factions that reach different conflicting conclusions. It's a way of ensuring that there's always a path for information and agreement to flow across the entire system. Now, what happens if some of these participants start behaving badly? Remember those Byzantine failures we talked about?
Yeah, the treacherous generals sending false messages.
Well, we can model that by deleting a set of participants, B, from the FBAS. We essentially remove them from the system and adjust everyone else's quorum slices accordingly.
So it's like those generals have been exposed as traitors and are no longer part of the decision-making process.
Exactly. And this leads us to the concept of a dispensable set, or D set. A D set is a set of participants that can be removed from the network without breaking its ability to reach consensus.
They're dispensable because the network can still function without them.
Precisely. There are two key conditions for a set to be dispensable. First, the remaining FDAS, after those participants are removed, still needs to have quorum intersection. Remember, that overlap is crucial for preventing the network from splitting into factions. Second, either the remaining participants themselves form a quorum, or the D set was the entire network to begin with. In an ideal world, all the participants exhibiting Byzantine failures would belong to a D set. That way, their malicious actions wouldn't disrupt the ability of the honest participants to reach agreement.
So it's like quarantining the bad actors.
A great analogy. You keep them contained so they can't cause too much damage. Now, let's consider a specific participant V. A V-blocking set for V is a set of participants that overlaps with every single one of V's quorum slices.
So if all the participants in a V-blocking set fail, V is essentially cut off from the rest of the network.
Exactly. They can't reach consensus because all the participants they trust to validate decisions have become unavailable.
That makes sense. Now let's talk more about how participants behave.
Well, we have two main types of behavior: well-behaved and ill-behaved.
The good generals and the bad generals.
A well-behaved or honest participant follows the rules of the protocol correctly. They make reasonable choices about who to include in their quorum slices, and they respond to requests from other honest participants in a timely manner.
They're playing by the rules.
Exactly. Ill-behaved participants, on the other hand, are the ones experiencing those Byzantine failures. They might intentionally deviate from the protocol, send false information, or simply fail to respond to requests. They're causing problems.
Trying to disrupt the attack plan.
Okay.
Hey, and all of this is happening within the context of slots.
Yes. A slot is essentially a unit of progress in the system. It could represent a particular transaction number in a blockchain, for example.
Okay, so this way of dividing time into discrete chunks.
A participant externalizes a value for a slot when they've processed all the previous information they need and are confident that all other correct participants will do the same. They're essentially saying, this is my view of what the state of the system is at this particular point in time.
It's a commitment to a particular version of the ledger.
Exactly. Now, one of the most fundamental requirements of any good consensus system is safety.
Safety first. What does that mean in this context?
Safety means that no two honest participants will ever externalize different values for the same slot. They'll never disagree about the outcome of a particular step in the process.
So everyone's on the same page about the order of transactions, for example.
Exactly. And the opposite of safety is divergence, where participants disagree about what happened. And then we have liveness. Liveness means that the network can continue to make progress, to externalize new values, even if some participants have failed.
The system doesn't grind to a halt just because a few generals are out of commission.
Exactly. And if liveness is violated, the system is considered blocked. Now, a correct participant is one that is both safe and live.
They agree with the other correct participants, and the system as a whole keeps moving forward.
And a failed participant is one that violates either safety or liveness or both. And finally, an intact participant is a well-behaved participant that's not isolated from the rest of the network by the actions of the ill-behaved ones.
So they're a good general who still has a clear line of communication to the other good generals.
Exactly. And remember that a participant's behavior can change over time. They might start out honest, but then become malicious, or vice versa. We have to be able to handle those kinds of transitions.
Okay, that all makes sense. Now, I know that SCP relies on a few key assumptions about the network. Can you walk us through those?
The first assumption is that messages cannot be forged.
Meaning that you can be sure that a message actually came from the person it claims to have come from.
Exactly. And this is typically achieved through the use of cryptography, specifically public keys and digital signatures.
Our old friends, cryptography.
The second assumption is that messages between well-behaved participants will eventually be delivered, even if there are delays or the order of messages gets jumbled up along the way.
So the messengers might take a while to arrive, but they'll eventually get there.
Exactly. We call this an asynchronous system. And the third assumption is that after we remove any dispensable set of participants, all the remaining participants' quorums will still have at least one participant in common.
That quorum intersection property.
Precisely. This ensures that even if some participants fail, there's still a core group of participants that can reach agreement and keep the system functioning. Okay, we've laid the groundwork for FBA and some of its key properties. Are you ready to dive into how this all comes together in the FLAIR Consensus Protocol?
Absolutely. Let's get to the heart of FCP.
Okay, so imagine we have a network with N participants, our generals. They're all part of an FBAS, which, remember, defines the structure of their trust relationships. They want to perform transactions. These could be financial transfers, data updates, really anything that changes the state of the system, and they need to agree on the order in which these transactions happen.
Makes sense.
Now, FCP doesn't rely on a single participant to broadcast their message to everyone else. Instead, it uses what's called a gossip protocol.
Gossip.
Yeah.
That sounds a bit informal for a system dealing with something as serious as financial transactions.
It might sound that way, but it's actually a very efficient way for information to spread through a large network. Think about how rumors spread. One person tells another, who tells another, and so on. Eventually, the information reaches a large number of people without any central coordinator.
I see. So how does this gossip protocol work in FCP?
Well, let's say Alice wants to send a transaction to Bob. She creates a message proposing this transaction, but instead of sending it to everyone, she picks a random participant, say Charlie, and sends it to him.
Okay, so the message starts its journey. What does Charlie do when he gets it?
Charlie creates a new message of his own, and this message includes a reference to the message he received from Alice, as well as a reference to the last message he himself created.
So he's essentially saying, hey, I got this from Alice, and here's what I was saying before.
Exactly. And by linking messages this way, we start to build up that directed acyclic graph, our DAG.
Okay, now the vertices are those messages, and the edges are those references back to previous messages.
And what's really interesting is that when Charlie creates his new message, he can also attach his own proposed transaction to it.
So the gossip protocol isn't just about spreading information about other people's transactions. It's also a way for participants to propose their own transactions.
Precisely. And this process repeats. Charlie picks another random participant and sends his message along, and so on. And if we could see all the messages being created and exchanged across the entire network, we'd see this big, complex global DAG emerging.
Okay, so that global DAG represents the complete history of the network.
But remember, each individual participant, like Alice or Bob, only sees a small portion of that global DAG. They have their own local DAG, which consists of all the messages they've received so far.
So it's like each general has their own partial map of the battlefield.
And this raises an important question. How do we ensure that all these local DAGs, these partial views, are consistent with each other?
Yeah, if they're all seeing different things, how can they agree on anything?
Well, two local DAGs are considered consistent if, for any two messages that are identical, meaning they have the same content, the same references to their parent messages, and the same digital signature, both DAGs also contain the same set of ancestor messages for those two messages with the same parent edges between them.
So it's not enough for them to have the same messages. They need to have the same history leading up to those messages.
Exactly. And the good news is that all participants in FCP are guaranteed to have consistent local DAGs.
Okay, that's a relief. How is that consistency guaranteed?
The proof relies on the properties of secure cryptographic hash functions.
Ah, those again?
If two messages have the same hash values for their parent messages, then we can be confident that those parent messages are identical. And this logic extends backward through the DAG.
If the hashes match, the messages match.
Exactly. So even though participants might have different partial views of the network, the parts of the history that they do share will always be the same. And as more messages get gossiped around, these local views gradually become more and more complete.
Okay, so the network kind of self-corrects over time.
Exactly. Now, we need to introduce a refinement to our idea of reachability to take into account the potential for those problematic forks we discussed.
Forks. The bane of consensus.
A message X is considered reachable from a message my in a local DAG if there's a path of messages from my to MEX, and none of the messages along that path were created by the same participant who also created a fork that's an ancestor of MEX.
So we're trying to avoid paths that go through potentially malicious forks. We want to make sure that the information we're relying on comes from trustworthy sources.
Precisely. And then we have the concept of strong reachability. A message MX is strongly reachable from a message my if two conditions are met. First, it has to be reachable in the way we just described. And second, there needs to be a quorum of participants who created messages that are reachable from my, and that can also reach MX.
So it's not just about a single path. It's about having multiple paths through a trusted portion of the network.
And that helps us build more confidence in the validity of the information we're receiving. Now, if an ill-behaved participant does create a fork, two conflicting messages, Lemma 3.2 provides an important guarantee. It says that if a message created by an intact participant is strongly reachable from one of those forked messages, then no message in any consistent local DAG can be strongly reachable from the other forked message.
Okay, so those forks can't both be considered valid. One of them has to be rejected.
Exactly. And this property helps us prevent those forks from causing inconsistencies in the network's understanding of what happened. Now, to keep track of how far a message has spread through the network and how well connected it is, we use something called a message slot number.
Okay, so it's like a timestamp that indicates where a message falls in the history of the network.
Exactly. The slot number is denoted as sigma of M, or sum. The initial messages, the very first messages that each participant creates when the protocol starts, all get a slot number of 1. For subsequent messages, things get a bit more complicated. A message gets a slot number of ease plus 1 if it's the first message created by its creator that's both strongly reachable from one of its creator's initial messages and strongly reachable from a set of initial messages that form a quorum for its creator, where ease is the slot number of those initial messages.
So it's getting its slot number from those initial messages that it's connected to.
Exactly. If those conditions aren't met, then its slot number is simply the maximum slot number of its parent messages. And Lemma 3.3 tells us that if a message exists in two consistent local DAGs, both DAGs will assign it the same slot number.
So everyone agrees on where a message falls in the timeline.
And that consistency is key for ensuring that everyone's view of the network's history is aligned. Okay, now within these slots, we have a special type of message called a core message.
What makes them so special?
Core messages are simply the very first message that each participant creates in each slot. They're the pioneers, the ones that initiate new rounds of voting. If a core message isn't a fork, meaning it's the only message created by its creator in that slot, then it's considered a unique core message. We use C to denote the set of all core messages, and we can partition C into separate sets CK based on their slot number K.
Okay. Core messages. Got it. And now we finally get to the heart of the consensus process, federated virtual voting.
Federated virtual voting is the mechanism that allows the network to reach agreement on the order of all those messages, and therefore the transactions they contain. And the key players in this process are those core messages.
Okay, so they're not just the first messages in the slot. They're also the ones that drive the consensus process.
Each core message essentially votes on the significance and connectivity of earlier core messages.
That's a popularity contest among messages.
A very important popularity contest. And we call each evaluation of this vote an election, and those elections determine which core messages become designated as pivots.
Pivots. What are those?
Pivots are the messages that have received enough support from other core messages to be considered definitive markers in the network's history.
Okay, they're the messages that everyone agrees are important.
And the way this works is through a voting function, myX. This function determines how a core message votes on another core message, myX.
Okay, so these messages are casting votes on each other.
And how they vote depends on the difference between their slot numbers.
The time difference in terms of slots.
Exactly. If the slot difference is 1,